Order, order. Cameron Thomas to move motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the dedicated schools grant. It's an honour to serve under your chairship, Ms Butler. I thank the F40 group for their assistance with this issue, those who have attended the debate and the Minister for her presence, which is greatly appreciated. I bring this debate forward on behalf of my head teachers, teaching staff, support staff and young people across Gloucestershire and those other local authorities amongst the lowest funded councils by the Department for Education across England. In its 2024 manifesto, Labour pledged to transform our education system so that young people get the opportunities they deserve. There is a clear alignment in that with the Liberal Democrats' commitment to increase per-pupil funding above the rate of inflation every year. Our goal is to support all pupils and expand educational provision, not to shift resources away from more disadvantaged counties like Gloucestershire. Schools in my constituency are faced with increased pressure right now owing to the inequitable dedicated schools grant, combined with the rising costs of special educational needs. Consecutive governments have failed our children because, with short-term mindsets, they have not adequately resourced education, through which our children could otherwise go on to boost every workplace across the country. Those governments left our children to emerge into a country where every public service is crumbling, but in which you need a university degree to become a police officer. Where Brexit took away our children's access to Erasmus and left a bitterly divided society. A society which is still struggling to readjust following the COVID-19 pandemic. When Sir Kevin Collins recommended a £13.5 billion COVID catch-up fund for our children, Boris Johnson's government fielded only 1/10 of that figure, and after so thoughtlessly spending billions on botched PPE contracts. Our children continue to suffer the consequences of that decision through a mental health crisis, an explosion in SEND demand, and almost 1 million young adults not in work, education or training. I entered politics because I believe in fairness, and I believe that whatever else we do in this place, there are two routes through which we can improve the future of our country: through political, including electoral reform, and through education, education, education. Within every child lies the potential for greatness, the potential to solve tomorrow what seems impossible today. Our children represent our hope for the future. They are yet unburdened by the decades of dogma, societal pressure, and institutional inequity which weigh upon us and dilute our own potential. In every aspect of our lives, we must strive to prepare the ground ahead of them and leave them a better country, a better world than was passed to us. Our teachers recognise this more clearly than any of us. They dedicate their careers to the fulfilment of our children's potential because there is no more rewarding pursuit than to help others to develop. No salary compares to being thanked in the street by those you helped and watching with pride as they go above and beyond what they imagined they could. Labour's 2024 manifesto described teaching as a hard-earned and hard-learned skill and pledged to work to raise its status. I commend both the observation and the commitment, but we are continuing to fail our teachers too. Our teachers are no longer simply expected to educate our children according to the curriculum. Governments and society continue to expect more and more of our already overburdened teachers. I'd be delighted to.
Would my honourable friend agree that teachers and teaching assistants at schools are the first line of defence against cuts to public services from the last Conservative government, and that actually the DfE, when they are asking schools to make efficiencies alongside the extra funding that they have had, means that some TAs will lose their jobs as a result? In fact, last week in my constituency of Esher and Walton, I walked into a school on a school visit, and the head teacher just had to let 2 TAs go because his school is facing a deficit of £200,000.
Cameron Thomas.
I commend my honourable friend for her intervention. I wholeheartedly agree, and I hope she'll pass on my empathy to her head teacher, and I'll be coming to just that point shortly. Our teachers are no longer simply expected to educate our children according to the curriculum. Governments and society continue to expect more and more of our already overburdened teachers. Increasingly, 4-year-olds are being introduced to school non-verbal, unable to use cutlery, and sometimes wearing nappies. But those are just the headlines. Discipline, time management, self and social awareness, self and mutual respect, moral courage, honesty, work ethic, public service, charity. These soft skills and attributes should be introduced in the home and honed within society as well as at school. And this government, with honest intentions towards our children's healthcare, now has teachers cleaning their pupils' teeth, just one additional straw upon the camel's back. It's no wonder that teaching assistant posts are vacated or lie empty when people can earn more working in the local supermarket. I understand that fixing the education system will be complex, expensive, and that action must also take place beyond the scope of the Department for Education. But something that can be addressed now is a more equitable allocation of funding. This will go a long way to remedying the situation for many schools in Gloucestershire and elsewhere. The Dedicated Schools Grant is the mechanism through which the Department for Education funds local authorities, which in turn allocate their resources to the schools within their jurisdiction.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I'd be delighted to. Thank
Darling.
you.
Thank you for giving way. One school in my constituency of Torbay has a £100,000 bill of due to the national insurance hike that is resulting in redundancies. Would my colleague agree with me that the national insurance hike is just exacerbating the inequity that many of our schools face in our local communities?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank my honourable friend, and I entirely agree with his statements. I have long been speaking out against the short-sightedness of that national insurance hike, and again I will come back to the short-termism that I think it's so important this government escapes. The Dedicated Schools Grant, it's allocated according to the national funding formula, which is outdated and which puts schools such as mine in Gloucestershire under increased pressure. Mainstream schools in the lowest funded local authority receive £5,000 less per pupil per year than they do in the highest funded authority. My mainstream...
Honourable friend give way.
Yes, please.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. In Oxfordshire, we only receive a area cost adjustment of just 2%, so that's to take into account the difference in cost of living in different parts of the country. In London boroughs, it reaches 18%, and that's simply does not match the cost of living in Oxfordshire, where house prices are very much comparable to London. Does he share my concerns, therefore, that this lack of funding is impacting the education of our children?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. As somebody who was, let's be generous and say, barely educated in Oxfordshire himself, I'm very much aware of the issue. My mainstream schools in Gloucestershire fall into the bottom 20% of DSG funding, earning £1,000 less per pupil than schools in the top 20. This means, for example, that Cleve School, with its 1,851 pupils, faces an approximate annual deficit of over £1.8 million compared with a similarly sized school, for example, in Middlesbrough. Please.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and agree with all of the points that he's making so far. This morning I spoke to the headmaster of Thomas Hardy School in Dorchester in my constituency. His previous job was a London Borough School in Croydon, where he told me that on average he received £10,000 per pupil. In West Dorset that figure is £5,000. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the government's funding formula for schools does not take into account the added cost of rurality, the added cost of providing services in places like West Dorset, and no doubt in his own constituency?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank my honourable friend from West Dorset, and with such gravity he says it better than I could ever hope to. Certainly the inequity is there for all to see, and it's interesting that one of his own teachers has experienced both ends of that scale. My own 4-year-old daughter and her friends will begin their primary school education in Gloucestershire in September. I want them to have, as Labour manifesto put it, the opportunities they deserve. To me, that means the same opportunities as every other child. But by the time they finish their GCSEs under this inequitable system, the Dedicated Schools Grant will have invested between £10,000 and £50,000 less in our children than those elsewhere in the country. The government might point to an upward trend in the Dedicated Schools Grant in Gloucestershire since 2021, but on the current trajectory, it will take 15 years to achieve equity. By then, My daughter and her friends will have long since left school. Unless the government acts now, their potential will have been diluted by the dedicated schools grant as is. By the time we achieve equity, according to trends based on the government's own statistics, the vast majority of those teaching today will have retired. My head teachers have told me that for most schools, approximately 85% of their funding is ring-fenced for staffing costs, but that rises to over 90% in some particularly desperate cases. The level of teaching experience in our schools is diminishing because our head teachers are having to make their most experienced and highly paid teachers redundant so that they can recruit less experienced teachers on lower wages just to balance the books.
Would the honourable member give way?
Yes, of course I will.
I thank you for giving way. In West Sussex, the deficit on our DSG grant at the moment is 130 million, and it will potentially double by next year. Yet, despite that, SEN provision, which is the main driver of that deficit, is deficient across the district. I have so many schools approaching me on this subject. Does he agree that we need not just to find some way of wiping out the deficit, but also removing the fundamental cause, which is ballooning costs of SEN provision?
I thank him, and he makes eloquent points. Clearly, the SEN crisis is exacerbating this to a significant degree, and I think what we are really looking for from the government is a long-term strategic plan to deal with this rather than just to push it down the line. Since 2014, mainstream schools are required to attribute the initial £6,000 of additional costs for SEND pupils from their own core budget. Owing to the inequity in the DSG, it's easy to see why this has a greater impact on those schools in lower funded authorities. Resources have become so stretched, many teaching assistants are only available to support pupils with the greatest SEND requirements. Underfunded primary and senior schools are taking drastic actions to balance the books. One primary school head that I spoke with spends his holidays in school, completing the tasks of a caretaker that he can no longer afford to employ. Across Gloucestershire, there is nothing left to cut. Head teachers are overwhelmed and cannot afford to meet the cost of any pay rise which may arise from the government's negotiations with teaching unions. The impact of an unfunded pay rise, I have been told, would be ruinous. Chair, I will conclude shortly. I recognise that this government inherited an utterly broken country from the Conservative Party which preceded it. It was a hospital pass, but almost a year down the line, my teachers remain on the front line of a genuine crisis to which they have been given no real answers. They don't have time for more politics as usual. They don't have another 15 years for this system to reach equity, and neither do they need more short-termism. They need their government to step up now, and with long-term solutions which don't simply pass these challenges down the line. In order to support teachers and enable them to plan for the future, rather than simply to stave off financial collapse, I'm asking the government today to please review the national funding formula and target funding to achieve near-term equity. Once again, Ms Butler, I thank you for chairing this debate, and I look forward to the contributions of others and the Minister's response. Yeah.